Should socialists support Zohran Mamdani? No. Okay, now you can all leave. But seriously, so what I want to talk about first is that I think that electoral, which is to say bourgeois politics, tend to be counterposed to the politics of the working class and the oppressed. And this is a quote from Marx's Capital Volume 1. He says in there, capital is dead labor that only lives vampire-like by sucking living labor. And I think we can see similarly, which is what I'm going to elaborate on in this talk, that elite or bourgeois politics can act to suck the life out of the politics of the working class, subalterns, or oppressed masses to the point of weakening or even killing them. We've encountered this, of course, through the consistent problem throughout our movement's history of opportunism, reformism, and alliance with liberals, and which have all appeared when our movement tries to do electoral politics. This has been noted since the beginning of our movement. For example, in the very late 1890s, in the Second International, a leader of its French section, Alexandre Millerand, entered the French government as a commerce minister in a sort of maneuver to keep out the clerical far right. And Rosa Luxemburg assessed this experience a few years actually before writing her classic takedown of Edward Bernstein. She writes, the government of the modern state is essentially an organization of class domination, the regular functioning of which is one of the conditions of existence of the class state. With the entry of a socialist into the government, class domination continuing to exist, the bourgeois government doesn't transform itself into a socialist government, but a socialist transforms himself into a bourgeois minister. Now, I wrote in my article, More Than a Ballot Line, from 2018 in the International Socialist Review, about how in the US, social democracy, that is to say reformist socialism, must confront the strict limitation of the political mainstream to two equally capitalist parties, one of which, the Democrats, has, by posing as a defender of the interests of the working class and oppressed groups, repeatedly thwarted any prospect of their independent organization. US Social Democrats, since the 1930s, have sought to maneuver inside the Democratic Party and try to make them an approximation of a European-style social democratic party. This is referred to as the strategy of realignment, or in more recent times, to run a so-called electoral guerrilla war, which will implode the two-party system. This is the tactic referred to as the dirty break. Now, my point here in evoking this history is that in contrast to Europe and European comrades who have faced left-wing, what would legitimately be called left-wing reformism, for example, in the cases of Syriza in Greece and Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party until 2019, we in America, in the United States, do not face left-wing social democracy. Instead, we face right-wing social democracy, which is dependent on liberalism, has an anemic reformist policy, and sees its future within the Democratic Party. This is why the proponents of the dirty break tactic, including Eric Blanc, who coined the phrase, quickly retreated from this position to one basically equivalent to the position of realignment. In that same article, I pointed out a dynamic of diminishing returns. In the US and elsewhere, reformist socialism, as I wrote, becomes more cautious with each new iteration. We see this in the stage of the Communist Party of the United States in the 1930s and 40s that sought to build socialism through an alliance with liberals evolving somehow into a classless society. A step down from that during the 60s when ex-revolutionaries Max Schachtman and Bayard-Rustin started their maneuvers inside the Democratic Party to try to transform it, like I said, into a European-style social democracy, but without the goal of socialism. Finally, around the time of Bernie's first and second campaigns, we got the initiative of the ballot line, or dirty breakers, who rather than trying to transform the party, or much less move to socialism, seek to split off a minority of progressive Democrats and their followers to form eventually a left populist party, I would say. And I would argue this is the outcome of social democracy's reliance on the electoral process as the sole avenue for change. Stephen Salaita, the prominent Palestinian American activist and academic, writes, "Electoralism is salted against insurgency. It's not a space for ideas, for creativity, for the simple decency of not asking the least powerful among us to defer their freedom. It's hostile to anything that impedes the reproduction of orthodoxy." He goes on, "Left electoralism diminishes socialism. By emphasizing celebrity, it cultivates an assemblage of ruling class stooges in leftist cover." In contrast, the politics I propose, and I think that Firebrand shares, and the Denver Communists, of course, share for the foreseeable future, is a politics of what I'm going to call for the moment electoral nihilism. This is a politics hostile to elections and electoralism, and particularly to the Democratic Party. This is a politics that realizes our main opportunities are not in the electoral sphere. In fact, the US electoral process limits us. And I call it electoral nihilism because say what you want to about the tenets of an international socialism, dude. At least it's an ethos. Okay. So I think what I just talked about, the classical Marxist understanding of elections, as well as the history of the US left's experiments with the Democratic Party, is very important to hold on to. If you don't have this, you can end up saying things like, as I heard a DSA member say at the Socialism 2025 conference barely a week ago, the Mamdani campaign, as he said, is the best thing the US left has done in the last century. So yeah, the last century, not the Scottsboro Boys campaign, not the free speech movement, not the Black Panthers, a mayoral campaign. That's the best thing we've done. And I think this is really a sign, right, of how elections, as Salaita says, limits how we imagine both our past and our future. Now, it's also worth pointing out that this attitude was kind of appeared at the beginning of our movement as well. Frederick Engels wrote after the revolutions of 1848, talking about radical representatives who had been elected to the parliaments of various German states. As he says, they had, from the beginning of their legislative career, been more imbued than any other faction of the assembly with that incurable malady of parliamentary cretinism, a disorder which penetrates its unfortunate victims with the solemn conviction that the whole world, its history and future, are governed and determined by a majority of votes in that particular representative body which has the honor to count them among its members. Now let's look at Zohran Mamdani himself. So his three main proposals, as people probably know, are a citywide rent freeze, at least on applicable apartments and applicable incomes. Second, citywide, city-owned grocery stores and free buses. Now, the rent freeze, I'd say, has been, very justifiably welcomed by working-class New Yorkers. I think it's this factor alone which probably won him the nomination. And it's worth pointing out, as mayor, Mamdani, should he pursue this, could actually do this on his own. But as our comrade B.C. Hamilton of Tempest wrote, his other reforms, the grocery stores, the free buses, and so on, are rather small bore. Furthermore, they require ratification by the state government in Albany for a tax increase. And of course, the state government in Albany is run by by neoliberal Democrats hostile to Mamdani and his program. But I want to point out that even genuine reforms such as the rent freeze do not have a proletarian class character when it's a bourgeois politician implementing them outside of struggle. We achieve reforms through combat with the government and with capital, building our independent forces, as Rosa Luxemburg said. Looking to elect Mamdani to deliver us a rent freeze is liberal right-wing reformism. As our comrade Charlie Post also from Tempest has recently said, this difference between revolutionaries and reformists can be expressed tactically, whereas revolutionaries focus on the strike, the riot, and on disrupting the accumulation of capital to achieve reforms. Reformists look first and foremost to vote, campaign, and lobby. As a result, we've observed a definite rightward moving dynamic from the campaigns of Bernie Sanders to those of AOC and the Squad to now Brandon Johnson, who I'm going to talk about, and Zohran Mamdani. Since liberals will not enact these policies, which would be their bread and butter, or would have been in a previous period, so-called democratic socialist politics run as Democrats, promising these basic reforms. Then in turn, radicals and revolutionaries move into the space that they vacated to pressure them or hold their feet to the fire as a loyal opposition. So this brings up the question, which was asked a lot at Socialism 2025. Will Mamdani sell out? The most common response that I encountered from this, at least at the conference, is that it was to sort of dodge the question. That instead of, regardless of whether he sells out or stays true, what we need to focus on is convincing his supporters to build the movements outside the electoral space to win the reforms he's proposed. Expressed differently, as one Tempest comrade said, we have to build people's self-confidence. Now, I agree that we need to build the self-confidence of the working class and oppressed masses, but doing that will not come from voting for a Democrat. I think this is a tactical error, and that we should say, rather than dodging the question, that Mamdani has already sold out by running as a Democrat in the first place. I wrote again in my More Than a Ballot Line article, the Democratic ballot line, rather than being an empty vessel to be filled with socialist content, represents, as Kim Moody rightly argues, the entry point into the maze of dead ends, false starts, and compromised hopes that is the Democratic Party. So what about Mamdani's prospects? First off, I want to point out that he could still face defeat in the general election by Eric Adams or Andrew Cuomo. I don't think it's likely, and the ruling class apparently find Mamdani so dangerous, incorrectly, again, in my opinion, that they want a unity candidate to defeat him. Important to note. But let's get back to how he will implement his reforms, such as the free buses and public grocery stores, which require a tax hike and therefore the sign-off of the state government. Our comrade Tyler Zemmer on his Substack has written, city government is severely limited by state law in terms of what it can do to democratically govern its own affairs. Since the financial crisis of the 1970s and the power grab by big business that followed its resolution, New York City has been in what Alexander Zevin describes as a kind of eternal receivership, firmly under the thumb of Albany. So, therefore, should he become mayor, once he becomes mayor, Zohran Mamdani will face the choice whether to become a friendly, neutered progressive, which is, of course, the route traveled by Bernie Sanders, AOC, and most of the Squad, or to pursue his program against the opposition of both Albany and Trump in Washington. I'd like to hear from what people think about this in discussion, actually, but I think it's pretty likely, given past experience, that he will choose to become a friendly, neutered Democratic Party progressive. Therefore, I'm going to proceed on the assumption that, as I said, he has already sold out or will shortly sell out, however you want to put it. Now, comrades who have more of what I would call a wait and see approach to Mamdani's candidacy have been bothered by this and have proposed two ways to stop it. The first is to call on Mamdani as a movement candidate to explain to his supporters that he won't have enough power as mayor to push his program through, that they, his supporters, need to organize to help him get the reforms that they both want. I think this is a dangerous misunderstanding of the electoral process. I mean that a candidate like Mamdani isn't going to disappoint the left, who are his supporters, by saying they won't have any power. He wants more support from the right and liberals, not to lose support in what's his base already. The second kind of way that comrades have proposed to address the problem of Mamdani selling out is to form so-called structures of accountability. One unaffiliated comrade put it to me like this on social media. She says, "For me, if I was in New York City, I would argue that our work begins now, that is, after the victory, to build infrastructures of accountability. Even simple neighborhood committees will do to start with, to both defend Mamdani from the right and push him to not sell out." Now, this idea of structures of accountability for left-wing Democrats is not without precedent. After Sanders' 2016 campaign, Our Revolution, his organization, appeared to many radicals who had worked on his campaign as a way to keep pressure on Bernie and his allies to fight. Instead, it became a traditional Democratic 503c4 fundraising operation. And I think we also need to consider the situation on the ground in New York. There's a Tempest comrade of ours who actually voted for Zohran Mamdani and organizes with JVP, who writes, "I'm close with many comrades in DSA and JVP, that is Jewish Voice for Peace, actively involved in Mamdani's campaign, and there is zero discussion about what, how, and whether to build the infrastructures of dissent needed to actually win the things Zohran is talking about. Outside of far leftists like myself raising these issues, which are often met with abstract agreement, there's zero talk of planning and building beyond electoral work." Now, I think it's fair to say that if the people who are most interested in doing this on the left wing of Zohran Mamdani's campaign can only abstractly agree, it ain't happening. And I think, again, this is an outcome of how the electoral process tends to short circuit the critical thinking of most people, including of radicals. These two flawed plans to hold Mamdani accountable, that conceive of him as an ally of the left who we have to keep on our side, have emerged in response to a fundamental problem, and it is a real one. This is the problem of how to relate to the enthusiasm of Mamdani's supporters without sounding aloof or being so-called ultra-leftists. Since 2015, when Bernie announced his first campaign, the US left has been unable to resolve this problem. The most common route out of it is for us to end up suspending our criticism and ride along, thinking we'll be able to criticize down the road. But I would argue that the Democratic Party cannot be ignored at any stage, and that delaying the criticism has led in most cases to suspending it altogether. I would argue further that Mamdani is not our ally. He is a successful competitor for our audience, seeking to implement nationwide a strategy that we recognize has again and again led to disaster. He has offered to become our enemy by running as a Democrat for executive office. We must focus on defending ourselves and our movements against the two-party establishment that he will shortly become part of. Now, the success of Mamdani's campaign, as I argued in More Than a Ballot line, is true for reformism in general, strengthens the argument not for opportunistic use of the Democratic ballot line to build a social democratic current, but ipso facto for broader and more extensive entanglement in the Democratic Party. Zohran Mamdani himself has proposed his campaign as a national model for local races. To quote our comrade Kenneth G. from Firebrand, the real function of politicians like Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, Johnson, and Mamdani is to confuse and disarm the left. They give the impression that change is possible within the Democratic Party. They provide political cover for the horrible policies of their more openly conservative colleagues, even when that policy is genocide. Most importantly, they divert attention and resources away from efforts to found an independent party, which could actually threaten the status quo. So, way of summing up, I don't think you can hold a Democrat candidate accountable after the election. The process seems to be rather that radicals will get mesmerized and campaign for the Democrat. And then once that person is in office, as Tempest comrades Andy Cernatinger and Emma Wild-Baltha state, they tell us, the Democrats, tell us, they're referring to DSA specifically here, what our positions would be, as Bernie and AOC did with DSA in the case of Palestine. Now, turning to another point, there is, I think, a very important example in our recent history that has a lot in common with Mamdani and can offer us a lot of lessons. I'm speaking of Brandon Johnson's campaign for mayor of Chicago and the involvement of the Chicago Teachers Union and the left in it. This is from in late 2023, of course, for people outside the US. So Brandon Johnson is a former Chicago teacher, a former CTU staff organizer, and he held office from 2018 as a Cook County commissioner, and specifically as a Democrat. The CTU, which is one of the most militant and probably most successful U.S. unions in the current labor movement, under the leadership of its reform-oriented caucus of rank and file educators, or CORE, since 2015 has had the strategy of winning space for its union and the labor movement in general within the local Democratic Party. The mayoral race was, of course, an outcome of this strategy. Johnson was praised in radical circles even before he became mayor as a charismatic individual, a great trade unionist, and a generally sincere guy, much like how Mamdani has been praised as a talented and effective communicator. Many leftists in Chicago argued at the time that the Johnson campaign, despite being in and of the Democratic Party, was an opportunity for the Chicago left to break into doing working class politics on a mass scale. As one Chicago teacher and Tempest comrade argued at the time, quote, "The dynamic in Chicago is unique, resting on the particular agent's legacy of class struggle and social justice unionism led by the CTU and its intimate links to the liberatory thread of radical Black politics. Particularly," as she went on, "the campaign was hosting discussions about the need for a party of our own that revolutionaries had to intervene in, lest we risk becoming irrelevant." Now, Johnson, like Mamdani, ran against an establishment candidate. The effects of the George Floyd rebellion and police brutality cases in Chicago had made the elite of including the Democratic Party, determined to make the Chicago mayor's race a referendum on the conduct of the Chicago Police Department. To do this, they chose Paul Vallas, who is actually a Republican, to run in the Democratic primary against Johnson. And of course, Johnson was victorious. In his victory, CTU backing was decisive. The CTU, along with its parent organizations, the Illinois Federation of Teachers and the AFT, put $2.3 million into his campaign. Furthermore, the CTU founded United Working Families Organization, or UWF, a membership organization that had support of certain other unions to run independent working class and POC candidates, also poured its efforts into Johnson's campaign. I think UWF's record is actually a really good chance to assess how accountability could be enforced on candidates like Mamdani and to reckon with the appearance, even on a city level, of an independent working class electoral force in the United States. Unfortunately, the record of UWF doesn't seem to be very positive. After Johnson's election, our Tempest comrade Brian Bean wrote, "Many, but not all UWF candidates hold Democratic Party committeeman positions within the structure of the Cook County Democratic Party. This is despite the fact that UWF members, when the organization was formed, had been mostly hostile to the idea of working within the Democrats." When Brandon Johnson became mayor, many of the UWF activists who helped him win were incorporated into his administration. UWF is significantly less active today, and the Chicago left, and by extension the CTU, is weaker, at least according to the accounts I've read. Johnson, even before becoming mayor, quickly distanced himself from Black Lives Matter, saying, quote, "I said defunding the police was a slogan. I never said it was my slogan." He also committed to hiring 200 more detectives. And he supported, of course, Joe Biden's administration at the time, which he argued had, quote, "delivered for working families." On Palestine, Johnson has held the position of a mainstream Democrat. As he said before he won office, "Any speech or effort to delegitimize Israel and its right to exist, that's how I view anti-Semitism." After October 8th, he played an instrumental role in ramming a pro-Israel resolution through city council by having Palestine demonstrators tossed from the chamber. As Joe Allen, writing for Tempest, says, this resolution helped set the tone for a wave of racist violence against Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims in the U.S., particularly the murder of 6-year-old Palestinian-American child Wadea al-Fayoum. This was in Plainfield, a suburb of Chicago, by his family's landlord. The landlord shouted, "You Muslims must die," as he choked Wadea's mother before stabbing Wadea dozens of times and killing him. Finally, Johnson brought the DNC, or the Democratic Convention, to Chicago in 2024 and brokered a no-strike pledge for its duration, which included the CTU. As demonstrators outside the convention hall recited the names of children in Gaza killed by the IDF, his police department beat them up, and conference delegates walking by closed their ears. Now, in contrast to Brandon Johnson, Mamdani has so far been a forthright advocate for Palestine. New York City's ruling class chose the sexual predator and nursing home murderer Andrew Cuomo to pitch the mayor's race as a referendum on Zionism in Israel. And again, like in Johnson's case, they lost. Mamdani is very much a child of the Palestine movement and moment. But let's look again at the recent record of U.S. Democrat reformists and social democrats on Palestine. And I'm referring especially here to Bernie Sanders. Sanders, as most people in this room know, is a liberal Zionist, especially those of us who organized around Palestine from 2015 until October 8th, know about the reverential attitude that many people, including Palestinian Americans in the movement, had towards him, regardless of this. Steve Salaita wrote, "Sanders' Zionism wasn't lost on his Palestinian American champions. It just didn't bother them." As he goes on, "Electioneering requires compromise, but compromise isn't a neutral practice. The people are made to sacrifice for the affluent. That's how compromise works under capitalism. Every time, every single time, it's some aspect of Palestinian freedom that must be compromised, never the candidate's position, never the system's inherent conservatism, never the ongoing march of settler colonization." After Palestinian militants launched the heroic Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 8th to change the game of the occupation and drawing a line in the sand against Israel's slow annihilation of their people, Bernie cheered on the IDF's invasion of Gaza. This, fortunately, exposed him to the movement, and he hasn't been able, at least not yet, to build back his reputation. Sanders' record demonstrates how soft Zionism and the two-state solution, which is Zionism, is the most radical stance that will ever be acceptable to the Democratic Party. Zohran Mamdani, as mayor in particular, can't do anything for Palestine. At least I don't think he can. I'd be willing to hear corrections on this as a mayor. And I would argue that this makes him potentially more dangerous to the movement than Sanders because he represents a permeationist approach for radicals at the level of local democratic politics, where the power is so limited and the maze is potentially endless. The Palestine movement in this country will thus face a sharp choice. Now, I want to quote Salida again because he's really the best and absolutely no bullshit on this question. He writes, Palestine has its own vocabularies of freedom worth forcing into the American conversation. It cannot be reduced to electoralism in the Democratic Party or anywhere else. Anti-Zionism isn't simply a politics. It is a sensibility, an attitude, a worldview. It is a refusal to accept any society predicated on suffering and displacement. It detests the ruling class. It rejects the misery presented as natural under capitalism. And it honors those old revolutionary devotions. Fuck Israel, fuck landlords, fuck civility, and fuck the police. Now, I've spent a lot of time arguing up to this point about what we shouldn't do, that we shouldn't support Zohran Mamdani. So what do we say to do? This is how I'm going to end the talk. So I would argue, as won't be a surprise, that voting and campaigning for Zohran Mamdani and other Democrats cannot be reconciled to building the struggles of the working class and oppressed people. As I wrote in 2018, because running as a Democratic candidate entails deprioritizing building powerful, disruptive movements of the working class and the oppressed, it is contradictory to the task of building real power. Now, today I would add to this not only running as a Democrat, but campaigning and even voting for Democrats today and retrospectively is contradictory to this process. So, about voting, why not vote for the guy who seems reasonably good? In the past, lots of us argued that we didn't really care who you voted for as long as you committed to being with us in the streets. But I'd argue today that voting, especially for a Democrat, is a commitment to the integrity of capitalism. Not voting for us, at least in Firebrand, is a commitment we make now to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. It's a commitment to building struggles in the streets and workplaces against both wings of the capitalist class, and to educate, train as activists, and cadreify in Marxism everyone we can. This is the basis for a new era of revitalized struggles against the crisis of Trump and Trumpism that we are already beginning to see. Electoral nihilism is not necessarily a permanent position. If a workers' party can be built on a mass scale at some point, we would, of course, want to intervene in it. This party could run for Congress, the State House, and City Council without, however, thinking for a second that the center of our struggle is there. Now, we rule out in advance running candidates for executive and judicial office: president, governor, district attorney, mayor, any kind of judge. All of these roles have frontline responsibility for repressing us and the struggles of the working class and the oppressed. We also aren't categorically uninterested in being part, should the opportunity ever arise, of a so-called left-wing government under capitalism. The examples of Salvador Allende in Chile, Francois Mitterrand in France, and Syriza in Greece more recently are lessons and warnings for us. Marx and Engels' approach, again, was also quite different to this electoral strategy. In 1890, when the Social Democratic Party of Germany was poised to make huge gains in the German elections, Engels' worry was that it would win too many seats. That is to say, he wanted to use the elections as a platform to recruit effective working class party members, not to get 50% plus one. Now, the tradition that Firebrand comes out of, and which includes Marx and Engels, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Leon Trotsky, all the people Ben mentioned. Um, when each of them considered the problems of a revolutionary party running in bourgeois elections, they all emphasized that the candidates and the eventual parliamentary fraction of the party had to be subordinate to the discipline of the party's democratically elected leadership. Our future party, based not on electoral district, but in the workplaces, movements, and working class and people of color neighborhoods, could run candidates for legislative office, but our sights would be set much higher than holding down seats on the city council, state assembly, or even Congress. So for now, we in Firebrand are electoral nihilists. That means we will not organizationally unite with those who do not have an absolute opposition to voting, campaigning, or running as a candidate for any bourgeois party. Our only defense here can be our immaculate politics. As Lenin said, reforms that a bourgeois legislative body can enact, he says, are only real in proportion to the intensity of the class struggle, and consequently, when Marxists merge their slogans and forces with reform-oriented members of the ruling class, as he says, we weaken the cause of revolution and consequently the cause of reform as well, because we thereby diminish the independence, fortitude, and strength of the revolutionary classes. Now I'm going to wrap up. I won't bullshit, comrades. This is a really tough position to hold, and we have committed to holding it long term. We're committed to holding it until the working class and the oppressed masses are ready to hold it with us. Much more storied revolutionaries than ourselves have been drawn into the electoral swamp, and in the US specifically, into the Democratic Party. Capitulation to capitalism, to paraphrase Lev Sedov, is an inclined plane, and no one who starts on down that plane has figured out a way of coming to rest once they start. The Democratic Party, I would argue, is to use a metaphor that was a favorite of Lenin's, is a chain. This chain is in Lenin's usage, the chain links all capitalist countries together, and every question of struggle under capitalism runs along the chain. The first link of this chain, I would argue, is the US state, and it runs through the DNC, left-wing Democrats such as Bernie Sanders, AOC, Zohran Mamdani, their organizations like Our Revolution, the fundraising operations, and NGOs, our unions, coalitions, and campaigns to the extent that we have not won them to anti-electoralism. And finally, the chain runs into the radical left itself. Through our arguments and actions, we can break the chain at this link. This is the first step, and we can convince our comrades to sever connections to the lower echelons of the Democratic Party where its tentacles extend into our movements. As our capacities grow, we will be able to break the other links of the chain as well. To quote Stephen Salaita one last time, he has written that recalcitrance towards Sanders, the Democrats, and the electoral process, as he writes, can be a deep, abiding act of love for Palestine. Staying true to our hard-won position on the Democratic Party and electoral politics is a deep, abiding act of love for our struggles, our class, our people, ourselves, and a wager on the communist future of humanity. Thank you, comrades.